Seek and ye shall find. Knock and the door shall be opened unto you. Ask and it shall be given. It shall be given unto you. Seek and ye shall find. Seek and ye shall find. Oh, just knock and the door shall be opened unto you. Oh, ask and it shall be given. It shall be given unto you. These blessings shall be mine. Oh, these blessings shall be mine. These blessings shall be mine. Oh, these blessings shall be mine. Shall be mine. Shall be mine, saith the Lord. Say, seek and ye shall find. Seek and ye shall find. Oh, just knock and the door shall be opened unto you. Oh, ask and it shall be given. It shall be given unto you. Say, seek and ye shall find. Seek and ye shall find. Oh, and all you do is knock. Shall be opened unto you. Open your mouth and ask. Ask and it shall be given. It shall be given unto you. See, blessing shall be. Blessing shall be mine. Ooh, blessing shall be mine. Shall be mine. Saith the Lord. Sing it again, say, blessing shall. Oh, blessing shall be. Blessing shall be mine. Blessing shall be mine. Shall be mine. Saith the Lord.
Good evening. Welcome again to another installment, Wednesday night Bible class, Bible study for the Southside Church of Christ and beyond, as we, you, and especially you and I, study God's book called the Bible in an effort to raise our biblical IQs and to become more conscious of God's will for our lives, in an effort to save our souls and to benefit others. I'm always honored and pleasured and thankful and glad to have this opportunity to sit with you. We're glad to be back in the sanctuary on Sunday mornings. Oh, our educational program is up and flourishing. We encourage all of you to come back, 10 a.m. on Sundays, Sunday school classes for all ages, adult class, and for every genre with our children. And then we have worship at 11. But we have not gone back, and arguably will never go back Wednesday nights in person. It's dangerous. It's not safe. You know by now gas is $5 a gallon, and we've had incidences that happen, and attendance is very low. But this venue, this Wednesday night venue, has proven to be very helpful, useful, and to reach the masses, and for that we are eternally grateful. Let us continue, Southside, to pray for those who just going through death and destination, and all kinds of things are happening in our world. I talked last week about when disaster strikes, and did God cause it? Why did God allow it? And what can you and I do about it? Tonight, allow me to segue and catapult into another topic that's pretty much under the same umbrella. Tonight, let's talk about the fact we should remember the poor. We should remember the poor. The early church and Christians today were obligated, and still obligated, to demonstrate our liberality toward poor, especially those who are our brothers and sisters in Christ. I am always a little perturbed and upset when people suggest that malfeasance in our society is caused from poverty. I totally disagree with that. If poor would make people act criminally, then our ancestors should have been the biggest criminals in the world. People don't even know what's poor now. Listen, ain't nobody, to be honest with you, poor is a relative term. To Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos and to Warren Buffett and to Elon Musk, I'm poor. You poor. Now, but to the rest of the world and to America, I'm middle class, you middle class. So poor is a relative term. You do know that most of us, the overwhelming majority of us, are rich in another country. We're just not rich in America. So remember, this is a subjective, not objective term when we talk about we should remember the poor. The early church mission, the early church engaged actively into benefiting the poor and the causes of poverty. The church at Jerusalem, Acts chapter 2, verse 44 and 45, the day of Pentecost, they were engaged to help the poor. Acts chapter 4, the great summit in Jerusalem, verses 34 through 37, help the poor. The church at Antioch, Acts chapter 11, verse 27 through 30, help the poor. The church at Macedonia, Paul took up collection. Paul instructed the other churches of Galatia to help the poor Christians in their poverty in Macedonia. Paul's help for the Christians, Paul always admonished the Christians to remember the poor. He encouraged the saints to take up collections for the poor. That's also found in Galatians chapter 2, verses 9 through 10. And 1 Corinthians again, chapter 16, 1 through 4. We use that to teach people about giving to the Lord. That real collection, that passage, which is a good passage, was for the church, a love offering for the church at Macedonia. And Paul, as you know, delivered that package to the saints in Macedonia. It is a fact, an unget-aroundable fact, an irrefutable, indisputable fact that we should remember the poor. And I want to operate on the three quick umbrellas tonight to accent the point that the church, as a collective, collaborative body, but you and I, as individual Christians, should remember the poor. We ought not always subjugate the church to help people who are impoverished. Sometimes you and I can go in our pockets or give a ride or give shelter or give meds or help out people without the whole church coming together to do it. There's some causes too big for an individual to help, but when you can help, you and I are obligated. Part of our Christian edict is to remember the poor. Let's go tonight under three umbrellas. Someone is poor who is asking for help. Let's deal with that first. When poor people are asking for help. Sometimes we assume poor people are poor because they're lazy. We assume that they're in a bad spot, a bad situation, because of something they did and didn't do. Or I've been to churches, I've been around where the congregation and Christians are inclined to make the poor earn what you give them. In other words, if you give them benevolence, now you need to come cut the grass or clean the building or You need to do this or do that to earn the benevolence. I believe that is a wrong mindset to remember the poor. In the words of Jesus, I know God has a heart for impoverished people, poor people, the neglected people, the doomed, the damned, the destitute. Jesus taught in Luke 6:20, he said, blessed be the poor. James said in James chapter 2, verse 5, the poor in this world are often the progenitors for God to show faith and righteousness. We often don't understand poorness and poverty. There's nothing wrong with you because you're poor. You can be poor and righteous, and you can be rich and wicked. Your economic status speaks nothing to your spiritual status. In Mark chapter 12, you remember the widow woman who gave at the offering, and God recognized her, Christ recognized her, for all of the bigwigs, the aristocracy of that day, walked and gave large sums of money, but that widow woman gave 2 mites or 2 pennies. And God recognized, acknowledged her righteousness, because he said she gave all that she had. She was impoverished, poor, but she gave God everything. And believe it or not, brothers, that's the highest giver in the church, the one that gives God everything. She was poor, but righteous. Poor, but generous. Poor, but godly. Poor, but followed the scriptures. So don't assume that something's wrong with people or make a judgment of their spirituality because they're on hard times. The causes of poverty, sometimes I don't think we investigate. Sometimes it's the actions of a person, and all this is true. All these things I'm about to mention could be contributors to poverty. Sometimes it is the actions of an individual, or the inactivity of an individual, or laziness. Solomon spoke to this in Proverbs 6, verses 6 to 11. Laziness causes poverty. Sometimes it's because individuals refuse to heed correction or instruction. Hard-headed, won't listen, can't tell them nothing. Proverbs 13:18 documents. The wise man says, when you refuse to heed correction, you're headed for a fall. Sometimes poverty is called by pleasure seeking. That's in Proverbs 21:17. Also in the New Testament, when the prodigal son had a lot of money left, but his pleasure seeking, his riotous living, his party nature, hanging out down there on South OBT, going to the clubs, trying to make it rain, buying drinks for everybody, he ended up broke. Sometimes pleasure seeking will cause you to be impoverished. Solomon went on to say in Proverbs 23:21, drunkenness and gluttony can lead to poverty. Sometimes it's your actions. Sometimes it can be the actions of others. Sometimes people contribute to their poverty. Sometimes they are victims of others' malfeasance. Such is the case in Proverbs 28 and verse number 8. Solomon says usury and extortion can lead people into poverty. He's talking about those who high and mighty who extort poor people. Exorbitant interest, exorbitant prices. Who can afford gas $5 a gallon and food going up exponentially at this time? Poor people suffer most when man extorts others. Isaiah chapter 3, verses 14 and 15, Isaiah said greed leads to poverty. The greed of man, the eyes of man, the abundance of man, when he does not see and know he has enough, but he keeps on like a leech and like a mosquito sucking blood out of others, it can lead to poverty. Another reason that sometimes these are self-induced, and sometimes you're victims of others that lead to poverty. I'm trying to explain biblical explanations of how people end up in poverty, possibly, so that we don't just judge poor people under the microscope of malfeasance. Sometimes Jeremiah says in Jeremiah 22:13, it can be because of unfair labor practices can lead to poverty. What they pay people, what they don't pay people. I encourage all you young people, any people, listen. They're not going to pay you $30 an hour with $10 worth of education. But man and church and society ought to offer livable wages to help keep people out of poverty. You can't, people like me, I don't have a lot of sympathy. If I can go back to school in my 50s and graduate with honors, with a wife and a house and children and grandchildren and a busy church, you could do that. I don't believe in making excuses, but I do believe in helping people who are not quite as fortunate as I am. Every day and every night in my prayer, I thank God for my blessings, and I pray for those who are a little less fortunate than me. And it may be because of what they did or didn't do, or just maybe life got them. Folks, I'm here to tell you tonight, I've been doing this a long time. I meet a lot of people. Sometimes people are victims of life. Life got them. And not what they did or didn't do, life. So sometimes it's unfair labor practice. Sometimes it's oppression. We live in a society that the upper echelon is more of a class system than a race system. I read the other day that in 1 week they announced Tiger Woods, Michael Jordan, and LeBron James are all billionaires. Billionaires. In case you don't know, it takes 1,000 million to make 1 billion. So if you got $900 million, you still ain't a billionaire. I'm here to tell you tonight, and LeBron James made $350 million playing basketball, 1/3. The other 2/3 he made in business, because what people do is, if you're in that class, they'll help you. No matter, even if you're not their race, but if you're in that class. We are oppressed often because of race and class. Oppression comes from people who are not like you. And there may be many similarities you have, but if you are not like them, you're probably going to be a victim of their oppression. Amos chapter 4, verse 1. Sometimes it's persecution. 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verses 1 through 2. Victims of systemic court or bad education or racism or sexism or poverty. Persecution can lead you to poverty. Oh, yes, it can. Sometimes, as we talked last week, you know what can make you poor? Natural disasters. Arbitrary, capricious things happen. Plagues. COVID-19 has left some businesses and people bankrupt, without a job and a house. Economic depression. We're in one now. Listen, if you were struggling before, and now gas and prices and inflation have gone up, economic depression, plagues, disease, wars, hurricane, earthquakes, tornadoes can tear your house down. You don't have sufficient insurance. You can wreck your car and you underwater with your car, so you need a car, but you can't pay the other one off. Listen, sometimes it's just stuff happens. Natural disasters can lead people to poverty. I know we don't want to hear this one, but we talked about it last week. Sometimes it's God's chastisement that leads people to poverty. God had to get some donkey. He had to take some stuff for you to remember who gave you the stuff. Yes, such was it in the day of Haggai, the prophet. In chapter 1, Haggai 1, 5 to 11. God said, I make your pockets with a hole in it. So every time you put something in it, it just went right through. Such as the day of Malachi, Malachi 3, verses 8 through 12. God will cause through chastisement for you to be impoverished. And you know what I found also interesting, beloved? Sometimes poverty was by choice, voluntarily by choice. That was the case with Jesus. He took a vow of poverty. Birds have nests, foxes have holes, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. There are other religions, including in Calcutta, India, with the world famous Mother Teresa. Often people would take vows of poverty, and that would be the case with Jesus. He didn't own a house. He didn't own a donkey. He didn't own a chariot. He didn't have any earthly possession, just the clothes on his back. He did it voluntarily. Sometimes people make choices to be impoverished. The apostles basically did the same thing. According to Mark chapter 10, verse 28, 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 10, and it's documented with Jesus in Luke chapter 9, verse 57 and 58. He voluntarily chose to be impoverished. Point number 2, and we'll move expeditiously, is there was provision made for the poor in the Old Testament. I want to show you that people ask for help. I try not to be judgmental. Well, if you wouldn't have done this, you wouldn't have done that. You can't help everybody. But none of us ought to be in a position where we help nobody. Listen to me again. No one person can help everybody, but no one person ought to be in a position where they don't help nobody. Okay? Point number 2 tonight. Look in the Bible and see provision was made, carve-outs were made for the poor. Poor people were not charged interest in the Old Testament under the law, according to Exodus 22 and 25. The poor were given the fruit of the ground after 7 years in the fallow season, when the ground was allowed to rest. The dividends of the harvest were given to the poor, according to Exodus 23 and 10. The poor were allowed to glean the fruit of the field after the harvest, according to Leviticus 19, verses 9 through 10. They were allowed to go out and just glean the fields. In the Old Testament, every 7 years, according to Deuteronomy 15, 1 through 4, every 7 years, the debt of the poor was canceled. That's where in our mundane, sophomoric, capitalistic society, we get this, your debt is forgiven in bankruptcy after 7 years. In the Old Testament, the debt of the poor was canceled every 7 years. Deuteronomy 15, 1 through 4. It also was counseled by Solomon to remember the poor. That's what we're talking about tonight, remembering the poor. In the Old Testament, Solomon said in Proverbs 14:21, happy is he who shows mercy to the poor. Solomon goes on in Proverbs 14:31, to oppress the poor is to mock God. Solomon goes further in Proverbs 17 and 5. When you mock the poor, you mock God. Solomon goes even further in Proverbs 19:17. When you have pity for the poor, you find favor with God. I think it's abundantly clear, and Jesus documented on one occasion, the poor shall always be with you, but me you shall not have always. Poor people are in the fabric of our society and our world. It gives us an opportunity to be like God. It also ought to remind you how blessed you are. Man, when I'm riding down the street and I see a guy on the corner slept there all night. I get to the office sometime, and there's people, a gentleman, young man, sleeping outside the 2 doors. And I'm careful. I believe the Bible, but I ain't crazy. I have to, look, man, you got to get up. You got to go. God bless you. I don't give out money at the church. If I do, he and all his buddies will be back all the time. And when I ain't got none, they'll rob me. So I got that much sense. But what I am telling you is poor people are everywhere. It ought to accent the point for you and you and you and I how blessed we are. The book says in Acts 20:35, it is more blessed to give than receive. That just means, you know how you know you're blessed? Because if you can give something instead of needing something, that's the blessed people. It's documented in the Old Testament. We talked about the causes for the poor. And when poor people are asking you for help, what's the causes of poverty? Does God cause poverty? It's a litany of that. Lastly tonight, we just talked about provisions for the poor in the Old Testament. Lastly tonight, let's talk about provisions for the poor in the New Testament. It was commanded by Jesus on his Sermon on the Mount. Matthew chapter 5, verse 42, remember the poor, he taught. And then his Sermon on the Plains, Luke chapter 6, verse 34 through 36, the Lord reminds the inhabitants of ancient Palestine and de facto, talking to the Christians and the saints today, remember the poor. Jesus lauded and applauded those who invited the poor into their homes and their houses. That's in Luke chapter 14, verses 12 through 14. You know, he often was ridiculed because he was found eating, supping, and drinking, fellowshipping with poor folk, and often sinners. And he commands you and I to remember the poor. Old Testament, New Testament, he said, let me judge their hearts and intentions. Just remember them. Now, this is not a lesson designed to make you a sucker. See, some people are just gullible to anything. They watch some on TV, there's somebody give them a sob story. God gives you what we call discernment. And he gave me an extra dose of that, just about always. I can't say 1,000%. I can talk to somebody 5 minutes and discern whether they're sincere or not, or whether they are off the reservation, or whether they're trying to put a con job on me. Just about always. Family, friends, church people. So those of you who are gullible-minded, believe every story, you need to pray for discernment and wisdom. What the Bible teaches is we should remember the poor, pray for the poor, help the poor, bless the poor, and in doing so, you bless yourself and you're reminded of how blessed you really are. Many causes for poverty. We talked about that first, when people are asking you for help. Then we talked about the provisions in the Bible, in the Old Testament, for poor people. Solomon and others documented their debt was canceled. They got the first food or fruit of the field. They got to glean the fields first after the harvest. Their interest was not charged to them according to Exodus. These are all benefits and provision made for impoverished people in the Old Testament. In the New Testament, lastly tonight, Jesus commanded in his sermonic dissertation on the mountain, bless the poor. His sermon in the plains, bless the poor. And Luke 14, invite the poor. James chapter 1, as we leave you tonight, verse 27 declares, the pure and undefiled religion is to bless the widows and the poor. That's when you're close to God, when you help people who really need help. If you're not careful, you find yourself blessing people who are already blessed. You buy me a gift, I buy you a gift. We do Christmas, we do birthday, we do anniversary. We end up blessing people who don't need a blessing. Matter of fact, most people you know, you order what you need. I don't know, let me think about it, child. You got everything. Why don't we get more of a mind? Well, let's find somebody who really could use. That single mother who's struggling. That single father who's struggling. That little old lady who's on fixed income, trying to get her medicine. Why don't we try to help people? Bite the school clothes for people who really need it. Those are the things I think we should do as Christians. and the Lord's church to remember the poor. So let it be written, so let it be done. The grass withers, the flower fadeth away, but the words of God shall stand forever. I want to invite you, beloved, this Sunday, as always, be in our assembly, 4701 Raleigh Street, right here in the city, beautiful Orlando, Florida. Sunday school. Our education begins at 10 a.m. sharp. Classes for all ages, adult classes and every genre of child known to man. 11 a.m. we start worship service. We live stream. I'm really pleased with the audience. People are starting to come back. Thank God for that. For those who can't or won't make it or live outside the region, you can watch us every Sunday morning. And after that, it's downloaded on Facebook and on YouTube, so you can watch it in perpetuity. If you don't get to it on Sunday, if you don't get to it on Wednesday, you can go back in and watch it from our archive. That's live stream on all of our social outlets. I want to encourage you to be there if you can't. Watch us and support us. And then every Wednesday night, we're back on this venue to study God's Word together. What a joy, what an ecstasy, what a privilege and a pleasure. God bless you. God keep you. This is our prayer. Always remember and never forget that we should never forget and always remember the poor. Good night.